Okay, now in this part of our discussion of the history of animation, I want to look at this other aspect of the Fleischer brothers. Now, this is something that can also inform our readings of other Fleischer brother works, certainly Betty Boop, and also to some degree Popeye. There's a way in which realism has played a really kind of key role, both sort of, as I put it here, both visually and ideologically in the work of the Fleischer brothers. And let me explain this. Visually, I mean that with the development of the rotoscope and this attempt to make animation look lifelike, the Fleischer brothers brought this basic kind of attempt at echoing the world. Basically, this sort of attempt at replicating a kind of realism that we see in other art forms in their animated work. And if we think about that in terms of the visual arts, keep in mind that different degrees of realism actually sort of make us sort of identify more or less with something. We can even apply some of Scott McCloud's ideas here because as much as there are, of course, some very kind of key distinctions between print comics and animated cartoons, one way in which we could think of some similarities is in terms of the degree of abstraction that we would have in a certain figure. So if a character appears to be sort of more universal, and by that I mean it's the more simplified features, something approaching more of a smiley face. That's different than if a character moves towards the photorealistic. But there's also one other element, and this is something McLeod doesn't account for because he's talking about a static medium. He's talking about comics, and he's not talking about animation. Animation is, of course, also characterized by movement. So we should think then about, what does it mean when we see different types of movement within an animation, and what does it mean when there are either higher or lower degrees of realism through that? And this is something I want you to think about because what happens with the early Fleischer brothers work is that in this attempt to kind of create a realistic looking animation, an animation that moves in the same way, in a way that appears to be lifelike, it almost actually sort of in some ways limits what can be done with the animation. And by that I mean that there are other possibilities for movement that don't mimic how things work in real life, that are sometimes sort of ignored in these early animated cartoons. So basically, realism kind of comes at the expense of other things that the medium could be doing. And I want you to think about this, especially when we sort of compare the early Fleischer brothers' work to their later work, such as Betty Boop and Popeye. Because with Betty Boop and Popeye, you actually kind of see the Fleischer brothers have fully entered the realm of animation and aren't really as concerned about realism anymore. One really kind of interesting example of this is in any kind of Popeye cartoon, Olive Oil is sort of really depicted as kind of very elasticy. Her arms kind of wave around in a way that just isn't actually, it's not possible in any realistic sense, and has a more kind of cartoonish quality to it. So, in many ways, as the medium matures, there's less of a desire to make it seem like other mediums. And here's a way in which the maturation of animation is in many ways a bit like the maturation of comics. With comics, that kind of question of like, well, what is this medium about? Is it a textual medium that's like fiction? Is it a visual medium that's more like film? These types of debates are ones that eventually kind of get moved to the side as the medium really becomes its own thing, and people involved in it really just have the confidence not to work in such a way that there is a constant comparison or need to draw from existing mediums. The same goes for animation. And with animation, we have to think, well, what is it really, right? It's, of course, very closely related to film and cinema, because it's using film for to create this type of tech, this the illusion of movement that we see in an animated cartoon. Now, I should say that some of the earliest animated cartoons actually weren't done on film. Some of them were done in the form of things like flip books. Some of them were done with things like the zoetrope. It's this device that you spin and you see an image moving in a certain way. So there's the earliest elements of the earliest animations that we have didn't actually really have anything to do with film, in that sense that they didn't make use of film and they were done using other devices. But film, of course, proved to be very ideal for animation, for the simple fact that it could very consistently move at a particular pace. It was very consistent in terms of in terms of the not just speed of the animation, but also in terms of essentially the kind of reliability. And by that I mean, if you look at something like a zoetrope or a flip book or something like that, they really rely on the user, in a sense, the viewer, to operate them in a certain kind of way. A zoetrope, as you spin it around and you're kind of looking through this little slot, and you kind of get the illusion of movement through these images that are very similar to one another, and it'll look like like a horse running or something like that. Well, the thing with something like that is that the quality of the animation and the exact illusion of movement varies very much depending on how quickly the zoetrope is turned. You could think about this with a flip book as well. I mean, you've all probably encountered a flip book. A flip book is one that you could start and stop. You have that option. You could do it backwards quite easily. And so there isn't really, basically the control of the animation is left in the hands of the audience, rather than something that's, the part of what the creators have consciously constructed. The creators may have an ideal sort of speed at which you're supposed to go through a zoetrope or a flip book, but you don't necessarily have to do that. There's another element to this which is, of course, very important, and one is that there are limits to what could be done with a zoetrope or a flip book. Now, flip books, to be fair, there were devices created that essentially used flip books and had very large, long flip books. So some of our earliest animations actually run several minutes long, but they were done essentially with a very elaborate flip book. So it can be done, right, to some degree, but as you might imagine, it would be really hard to do this with something longer. Definitely, with anything feature length, this would be exceptionally difficult to do. So film allows for this to be expanded, essentially. And we can then think of film that really kind of removes any barriers in terms of length. The only real practical barriers for the length of an animation is how long an audience might want to sit through it, or the means through which we distribute it. And by that I mean feature length animation in a movie theater. Well, in theory you could make a 12-hour animated film, but that just doesn't really fit into the typical time slot in terms of how movie theaters organize their space and time. But there's no real technological reason that you can't make an animated film as long as you want. So film really opens that up. Having said that, you'll notice that these first animated films, these early ones from the Fleischer Brothers, are quite short. And it was some time before they and others expanded this and started thinking in terms of longer narratives. This is something that actually kind of comes about, though, as you'll see, as the Fleischer Brothers kind of move through their different periods. So in this early period where we focus on things like Coco the Clown, they're very short. They're relatively short animations, and the animation is mixed with a lot of live action footage, in part because the live action footage is just simply cheap, to make compared to the animation. It's to have a few seconds of live action is much easier to do than it is to have a few seconds of animation. All that animation takes an incredible amount of labor. So it's a labor-intensive process, and that's one of the things that limits the length of an animated film. But what we see as we sort of move on is that the Fleischer brothers then start, experimenting with length. Betty Boop cartoons tend to run longer. And when we get to some with Popeye, some actually run, into the range of 15 minutes, which is actually quite long for stuff of this period. So I'm going to just show you a little bit now of a very short little documentary bit talking about Dave Fleischer and essentially kind of his role with the Fleischer brothers and that kind of degree of realism he brought in. I mean, he both sort of posed, as the clown, and he ended up having other elements of his experience that kind of enter into the world of Fleischer brother animations. Along with this little mini, 2 or 3 minute documentary bit, there are also a couple of animated. There are a couple of animations by the Fleischer brothers, I should say, that will highlight some of this focus on realism. So I want you to think about that in terms of how realism works here, how these early elements of the Fleischer brothers, how it really informs their sensibilities, and it forms both the style and it informs the content. Because what we'll see as we move on to their later work is that this interest in realism wanes, and they become more interested in possibilities that animation can offer that aren't common to things like live action film or anything else that's based in realism.
Since much of the success of Out of the Inkwell was based on the actions of Dave Fleischer, he was brought on to continue as the clown for rotoscoping. He also doubled as a film cutter and played characters on the screen. Dave was streetwise, considered a bit crude in his mannerisms and speech. Yet in many other ways he was underestimated. He had worked as an usher at the Palace Theater, where he gained exposure to the great vaudevillians of the day. And one of his favorite acts was the team of Weber and Fields.
Here, put the ball down here. Put the ball down here. No, leave it there. I want to hit him. You must always commence from the pimple. You see the pimple here? That's a pimple? That's a pimple, yes. Start from there. It's going to be a fight. Keep your seat. Oh, I'm not worried. Don't worry about it. Now remember, you got to bust the balls before you break them.
This early exposure contributed to Dave's sense of gags and comedic timing, and became the foundation for the humor of the Fleischer cartoons.
Dave was a slapstick comic. He was a very funny guy. He was just a naturally funny person with a wild sense of humor. And the two of them together, when they worked together collaboratively, were brilliant, as the early cartoons illustrated.
In 1921, Dave won $20,000 on a horse race. And since Out of the Inkwell was the most popular entry on the Bray program, Dave convinced Max to start his own studio. So with a combined investment of $1,200, they started Out of the Inkwell Films in the dingy basement apartment on East 45th Street. The staff then consisted of their brother Joe Fleischer, photographer Charlie Shetler, and Bray animator Roland Doc Crandall. In spite of his vaudeville influence, Dave's presence was not felt in the beginning.
So we would gravitate to Max before anything else, because he was the great white father, He was the one you could go to at any time. He was the one who had the credits, all the credentials. And whereas Dave coming in to us was a newcomer. We were old-timers, in our 20s.
With Out of the Inkwell as an established popular short subject, Max secured a distribution contract, and the first production of the new Inkwell studio was released on October 1st, 1921.